He thought he was the law, until the law walked in wearing silence. The courtroom in downtown Richmond carried that familiar weight, the kind that pressed against your chest the moment you stepped inside, where every footstep echoed a little too loud, and every whisper felt like it was being judged, fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a pale glow across polished wooden benches and cold marble floors. The American flag standing still in the corner like it had seen this story play out 1,000 times before, because in many ways it had, and on that morning, Officer Daniel Brooks walked in like he owned every inch of it, shoulders squared, badge gleaming, his boots striking the floor with slow, deliberate confidence, the kind of confidence that didn't come from justice, but from never being questioned, never being challenged, never being told no. And people noticed, they always did. The way conversations softened when he passed, the way eyes dropped just enough to avoid attention. Because everyone knew who he was, not officially, not on paper, but in the way systems remember their enforcers. And then there was her, sitting quietly near the front row, hands folded over a thin leather folder resting on her lap, dressed in a simple navy blazer, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. And yet there was something about her stillness, the kind that didn't ask for space but somehow held it anyway. Ava Carter didn't look up when Brooks first noticed her, didn't react when his gaze lingered longer than necessary, because she had felt that gaze before, in rooms like this, in cities like this, where silence often spoke louder than words. And for a moment, everything moved as expected. Clerks shuffled papers, attorneys checked their watches, a bailiff leaned against the wall with practiced boredom, until Brooks changed the rhythm. It started small, just a glance, then a smirk, then a step closer. You waiting for something? His voice cut through the air sharper than it needed to be, drawing a few eyes without fully breaking the room. Ava didn't respond. Not immediately. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, calm, steady, like she was listening to something deeper than his voice. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate him, because men like Brooks weren't used to being ignored, weren't used to not getting a reaction. This area's not for the public, he added, louder this time, enough for a couple of people nearby to shift uncomfortably. A faint chuckle somewhere in the back, the kind that disappears as quickly as it appears, and still, she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give him the moment he was trying to create. And if you had been standing there, watching it unfold, you might have felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, like something unseen had just entered the room, something patient, something waiting, because what Officer Brooks didn't realize, what no one in that courtroom realized yet, was that this moment, this interaction, this quiet refusal to respond, it wasn't weakness, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't fear, it was timing. And somewhere beyond those closed wooden doors, footsteps were approaching, measured, deliberate, carrying with them a truth that was about to change everything. The air did not shift all at once, it tightened slowly, like a room holding its breath without realizing it. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it even if he could not name it, a subtle resistance in the silence that stood in front of him, because Ava Carter still had not responded, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly on the folder as if nothing in this room had anything to do with her. And that calm, that unshaken stillness, it did something to him. It made his voice sharper, louder, as though volume could force control back into his hands. I asked you a question, he said, stepping closer now, his presence looming in a way that had worked countless times before, the kind of pressure that usually made people fold, apologize, move. But she did not move. Not even an inch, and that was when the room began to notice, not openly, not in a way that anyone would admit later, but in the small ways. A clerk pausing mid-page turn, a lawyer lowering his pen, the bailiff straightening, just slightly, because something about this exchange did not follow the script they were used to. Brooks let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You cannot just sit wherever you want, he continued, his tone carrying just enough edge to draw attention without crossing into anything official. There is a process here, rules, and for a brief second, his words hung in the air like they were supposed to land somewhere, like they were supposed to matter. Ava finally lifted her eyes, slow, deliberate, meeting his gaze not with defiance, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, as if she had already seen this moment play out before it even began. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, almost quiet enough to miss if you were not listening closely. I am exactly where I need to be. No emphasis, no challenge, just a statement, and it landed heavier than anything he had said, because it did not try to compete, it did not try to win, it simply existed, and for a fraction of a second, Brooks hesitated, not visibly, not in a way anyone could point to, but enough for the rhythm to falter, enough for the room to feel it. And that was when the first whisper moved through the back rows, low and uncertain, the kind of whisper that does not ask a question out loud, but carries one anyway. Brooks recovered quickly, or at least he thought he did, his jaw tightening, his voice rising just a little more. Then you will not mind moving when I ask you to, he said, but the authority in his tone no longer felt as solid. It sounded rehearsed, like a line repeated too many times without being questioned. Ava did not answer again. She simply held his gaze for one more second, then lowered her eyes back to the folder, as if the conversation had already ended, as if his presence had already been accounted for and dismissed without effort. And that was when something unfamiliar crept into Brooks's chest. Not doubt, not yet, but something close to it, because for the first time that morning, it felt like he was the one standing in the wrong place. And before he could push further, before he could reclaim the moment he thought he controlled, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a firm, echoing sound that cut clean through the tension, and every head in the room turned at once. Because some sounds do not need explanation, some sounds mean one thing and one thing only. And in that instant, without a single word being spoken, the balance of the room began to shift. The sound of the doors closing echoed deeper than it should have, as if it carried weight, as if it announced something more than just an arrival. And in that instant the scattered murmurs died without being told, chairs shifted, papers stilled, and one by one, people began to rise, not out of confusion but instinct, because some moments in a courtroom do not need instruction, they are felt, and as the bailiff's voice followed, clear and firm, it cut through whatever control Officer Daniel Brooks thought he still had. All rise. The words landed with finality. And the room obeyed, every person standing except one. Ava Carter remained seated for just a fraction of a second longer, not out of defiance, not out of delay, but because she was never part of the movement to begin with. And then she stood, smooth, composed, her hand lifting the folder from her lap as if it had always belonged there, as if everything about her had always belonged exactly where it was. Brooks turned slightly, his attention pulled toward the front as the side door near the bench opened, expecting the familiar routine, the judge entering, the formality, the structure he understood, the structure that always reinforced his place in it. But something in the rhythm was off, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable, because the eyes of the courtroom were not fixed on the bench where they should have been. They were shifting, tracking, following a different line, and that was when Brooks noticed it, not all at once, but piece by piece. The clerk near the front straightened more than usual, a prosecutor adjusted his stance, a defense attorney lowered his gaze entirely, and none of them were looking toward the door anymore. They were looking toward her, toward Ava, and for the first time that morning Brooks felt something he could not immediately control, a flicker of confusion, quick and sharp, because the script was changing without his permission. The bailiff continued, voice steady, practiced, but now carrying a weight that seemed heavier than before. The Honorable Judge Ava Carter presiding. And just like that, the words did not echo, they settled, they landed, they reshaped the room in a way that could not be undone. And if you had been standing there you would have felt it too. That precise moment when reality corrects itself, when assumption collides with truth. Brooks did not move, not right away. His body remained upright, but rigid, as if his mind had not caught up to what his ears had just heard. Judge. The word repeated silently, not fitting, not aligning with the image he had already decided was true just minutes earlier, and yet everything around him confirmed it. The way the room remained standing, the way silence deepened instead of breaking, the way Ava stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the quiet authority of someone who had walked this path long before anyone else noticed, her heels making soft contact against the polished floor, each step measured, controlled, until she reached the bench, and in one fluid motion she placed the folder down, turned, and took her seat. and only then did she look up again, her gaze sweeping across the room with calm precision, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging what was already hers. And when her eyes found Brooks, it was not anger that met him, not satisfaction, but something far more unsettling, certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself, the kind that does not react because it already knows. And in that moment the distance between them shifted completely, no longer officer and civilian, no longer voice and silence, but something else entirely, something that had been true from the beginning whether he recognized it or not. The balance had changed, and there was no way back. The room remained standing for a beat longer, just long enough for the weight of the reveal to settle into every corner. Before Ava spoke, her voice even, composed, carrying effortlessly across the courtroom. "You may be seated." And as chairs moved in unison and the room lowered itself back into place, one thing was clear without anyone needing to say it. Officer Daniel Brooks was no longer in control of anything. The sound of chairs settling back into place came in waves, soft but uneven, like the room itself needed a moment to catch up with what had just happened. And for a brief second, no one spoke, not the attorneys, not the clerk, not even the bailiff, because something invisible had just shifted and everyone felt it. Everyone except the one man still trying to understand where he now stood. Officer Daniel Brooks remained near the aisle, his posture still upright, but no longer certain, his hands no longer resting as confidently at his sides. And if you looked closely, you would see it, that small delay between thought and reaction, the hesitation that had never belonged to him before, because moments ago he had been the one directing attention, the one shaping the room with his voice, and now he was standing in a space that no longer responded to him. Judge Ava Carter adjusted the file in front of her with calm precision, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time itself moved differently at the bench, her expression composed, unreadable, not because she was hiding anything, but because she did not need to show anything. And when she finally spoke again, her tone carried that same quiet authority, steady and controlled. "Let us proceed." Simple words, nothing dramatic, and yet they carried more weight than anything Brooks had said earlier, because they did not demand attention. They commanded it without effort. The clerk nodded quickly, shuffling papers that suddenly seemed more important than before. Attorneys leaned forward, their focus sharpened, and the courtroom resumed its function, but not its previous balance, because beneath the surface, everything had changed. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but enough to signal that something inside him was recalibrating. He glanced toward the exit for just a fraction of a second, not to leave, but as if confirming that the room had not changed physically, that the doors were still where they should be, that the walls had not moved. But it was not the room that had changed, it was his position within it, and that realization settled slowly, like a weight that could not be shaken off. Ava's eyes lifted briefly, not scanning the room, not searching for reactions, but landing exactly where they needed to, on him. And when their gazes met again, there was no trace of the earlier silence he had mistaken for vulnerability. Instead, there was clarity, sharp and unwavering, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single exchange, the distance between the bench and the aisle stretching into something far greater than a few feet, something defined not by space but by authority. Brooks straightened instinctively, as if his body remembered protocol even if his mind was still catching up, his chin lifting slightly, his shoulders pulling back into something that resembled composure. But the difference was there, subtle but undeniable, because composure built on control feels different from composure built on uncertainty. And everyone in that room, whether they realized it or not, could feel the distinction. Ava turned her attention back to the documents in front of her, but her voice followed, measured, precise. "Officer Brooks," she said, and the use of his name, clear and direct, landed with a different kind of weight, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, and that made it harder to ignore. He responded immediately, "Yes, Your Honor." The words came out correctly, formally, but there was a fraction of a second before them, a pause that had not existed earlier, a pause that revealed everything that had changed, and in that moment, it was not just a title being acknowledged, it was a reality being accepted, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. The same man who had tried to define the space minutes ago was now standing within it under a different set of rules. And as the proceedings began to move forward, one thing became clear in a way that did not need explanation. Authority had not just shifted, it had been revealed. It had been there all along, waiting, silent, patient, until the moment it no longer needed to wait. The rhythm of the courtroom returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm. It moved with a different kind of precision now, sharper, quieter, as if every sound understood it was being measured, every word placed carefully before it was spoken, and at the center of it all sat Judge Ava Carter, composed, steady, her presence no longer unnoticed, no longer questioned. Because the room had already adjusted around her authority, the clerk began reading the docket, voice slightly tighter than before, names and case numbers flowing in a practice sequence. But even that routine felt different, because attention kept drifting, not openly, not in a way that would interrupt proceedings, but in subtle glances, quick looks toward the bench, toward her, and occasionally toward him. Officer Daniel Brooks stood where he had been, but not as he had been, his stance now more rigid than confident, his hands resting in a way that suggested awareness rather than control, and if you listened closely you could almost hear it, that internal recalculation, that quiet shift where certainty used to be. Ava turned a page in the file before her, the sound of paper sliding against paper soft but deliberate, and when she spoke again, it was not louder than before, not harsher, just clearer. Before we proceed with the scheduled matters, there is something that needs to be addressed. The sentence did not rush, it settled into the room, and once again, attention sharpened, attorneys paused mid-note, the bailiff's posture straightened fully now, and Brooks felt it, that same tightening in the air, but this time there was no confusion attached to it, only awareness, because he understood, at least in part, that whatever came next was not separate from what had already happened. Ava's eyes lifted from the file, not scanning, not searching, but directed, precise, landing on him with the same calm certainty as before. "Officer Brooks," she said again, and this time there was no pause before his response. "Yes, Your Honor." The words came quickly, correctly, but still carrying that faint echo of adjustment, as if his voice had not fully settled into this new reality. Ava nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, yet it carried acknowledgement, not approval, not disapproval, simply recognition of presence. A few minutes ago, before this court was called to order, there was an interaction that took place in this room. Her tone remained even, controlled, free of accusation, and that made the words land heavier, because they did not need force to carry meaning. The room grew still again, not because anyone was told to be silent, but because silence felt necessary. Brooks did not speak, he did not shift, but something in his posture tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction that comes when a moment you hoped would disappear instead becomes the center of attention. Ava continued. "This courtroom operates under standards that apply equally to every individual present, regardless of role, title, or assumption. Each word placed carefully, not rushed, not softened, simply stated." And as she spoke, there was no change in her expression, no rise in her voice, because authority did not require performance. It required clarity, and clarity was exactly what she was delivering. Brooks swallowed, a small, almost invisible movement, his gaze fixed forward now, not on her, not on anyone else, as if focusing on a single point might steady the ground beneath him. Ava allowed a brief pause. Not long, just enough for the words to settle, for the meaning to be understood without needing repetition. "Respect within this space is not optional," she added, and the sentence closed the gap between observation and expectation, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a boundary, clearly drawn, and impossible to ignore. The clerk remained still, pen hovering above paper, waiting. The attorneys did not move, and Brooks finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers again, but this time there was no attempt to assert, no attempt to challenge, only acknowledgement, quiet and controlled, because in that moment, there was nothing left to question, only something to accept. Ava held that gaze for a second longer, then nodded once more, a signal not of closure, but of continuation. "We will proceed," she said, and just like that, the courtroom resumed. But no one in that room would mistake what had just occurred for something small. Because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come with raised voices or dramatic action. Sometimes it arrives in calm sentences, in measured tone, in the quiet understanding that the balance has already been restored. The proceedings moved forward, but the atmosphere no longer allowed anything to pass unnoticed. Every word now carried weight. Every glance held meaning. And beneath the surface of routine legal exchanges, something far more deliberate was unfolding. Judge Ava Carter listened as the first case of the morning was called, her posture unchanged, her attention precise. But there was a subtle shift in the way she engaged, not distant, not detached, but deeply aware, as if she were not only hearing what was being said, but measuring everything that surrounded it, the tone, the hesitation, the confidence or lack of it. Because this was not just a courtroom to her, it was a system, and systems revealed themselves in patterns. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing along the side, his presence now quiet, contained, but not invisible, because even in stillness he could feel it, the awareness directed toward him, not openly, not accusingly, but unmistakably present, like a mirror he could not step away from. Ava leaned slightly forward as a defense attorney presented an argument, her eyes focused, her expression neutral, yet attentive in a way that suggested she was connecting details beyond what was spoken. And then, just as smoothly as the case concluded and the next was about to begin, she lifted a single document from the folder that had rested in front of her since before the courtroom was called to order, the same folder she had held while sitting quietly in the front row, unnoticed, unchallenged, until she was not, and the movement itself was small, almost routine, but it carried intention, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already aligned with something larger. Before we continue, she said, her voice steady, interrupting the flow not with force but with certainty, and immediately the room responded. The clerk paused, attorneys lowered their voices, and Brooks felt it again, that tightening. But this time there was no confusion, only recognition. Ava opened the document, her eyes scanning it briefly, not because she needed to read it, but because she understood the value of letting the moment breathe, of allowing anticipation to settle into the room. And then she spoke. This court has been reviewing a series of internal reports concerning conduct within this jurisdiction. The words were precise, formal, but beneath them was something sharper, something that reached beyond routine procedure. A ripple moved quietly through the room, not visible, not audible, but present, because people understood when something extended beyond the case at hand. Brooks's jaw tightened slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for him to feel it, because now the moment was no longer about a single exchange. It was expanding, connecting, revealing threads he had not considered. Ava continued. These reports include documented observations, recorded interactions, and corroborated accounts, each phrase placed carefully, building not tension, but clarity, and clarity has a way of making avoidance impossible. Brooks shifted his stance just slightly, the smallest adjustment, but one that spoke volumes. Because standing still had begun to feel like standing exposed. Ava's gaze lifted again, meeting his. Without hesitation, without urgency, just alignment. Some of these observations took place in this very room, she said. And there it was, the line that connected everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer neutral. It was aware. Brooks inhaled slowly, controlled, measured, as if preparing himself for something he could no longer predict. Ava closed the document gently, her hand resting on it for a moment, not as a gesture of finality, but as a signal that what had been opened could not be undone. This court does not operate on assumption, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. It operates on record, on truth, and on accountability. And as the words settled, something became clear to everyone present. This was not a reaction. This was not spontaneous. This was prepared, intentional, and far more comprehensive than a single moment of disrespect. Brooks lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, not yet, but in recognition. Because the ground beneath him was no longer shifting. It had already shifted, and now he was simply standing on it. Ava allowed a pause, just long enough for the weight of that understanding to settle fully into the room. before she continued. We will address this appropriately. And with that, the path forward was no longer uncertain, it was defined, and no one in that courtroom, least of all Officer Daniel Brooks, could pretend otherwise. The silence that followed her last words did not feel empty. It felt structured, like something had just been set into motion, and everyone in the room could sense it unfolding even before the next step was spoken. Judge Ava Carter remained still for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the closed document, her gaze steady but not fixed on anyone in particular, because she did not need to search for reactions. She already understood them. The shift had already happened, and now it was simply revealing itself layer by layer. Officer Daniel Brooks stood where he had been, but the space around him felt different, no longer neutral, no longer familiar. It felt observed, measured, and for the first time that morning he could not rely on instinct alone, because instinct required control, and control had quietly slipped away. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture composed, her voice calm as she continued. This review did not begin today, and that single sentence carried a depth that extended far beyond the moment, because it reframed everything. This was not a reaction to what had just occurred. It was part of something already in progress, something already documented, already understood. A quiet ripple moved through the attorneys seated in the front rows, not visible, but present in the way their attention sharpened, in the way their posture adjusted just slightly forward. Brooks's eyes lifted again, meeting hers, and this time there was no attempt to hold the gaze for long, because what he saw there was not confrontation, it was certainty, and certainty leaves very little room for argument. Ava continued, her tone unchanged. Over the past several weeks, this court has received consistent reports regarding conduct that does not align with the standards expected within this jurisdiction. Her words remained measured, deliberate, but they carried weight because they were supported by something unseen, something already established. Brooks felt it settle into him, not all at once, but gradually, like a realization forming piece by piece, because this was no longer about perception, it was about record, and record does not rely on opinion. Ava opened the document again, turning a single page with quiet precision, allowing the sound to carry just enough to mark the moment. These reports were not acted upon immediately, she said, because verification matters, and the emphasis was subtle, but clear. Every word placed with intention, every pause controlled. And now, that verification is complete. The room remained still, but the silence had shifted again. It was no longer just attentive, it was anticipatory, because everyone understood that something definitive was about to follow. Brooks adjusted his stance again, barely noticeable, but this time it was not about posture, it was about grounding, about finding balance in a moment that no longer offered it naturally. Ava's gaze returned to him, not sharply, not abruptly, but directly. Officer Brooks, she said, and his name in that context carried more than identification. It carried placement. He responded, "Yes, Your Honor," his voice steady, but quieter now, as if instinctively matching the tone of the room. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the response. "You were present in multiple instances referenced within these reports," she stated, "not as an accusation, not as a question, but as a fact, and that distinction mattered. Because facts do not require defense to exist." Brooks did not immediately respond, not because he could not, but because he understood that whatever he said would not change what had already been established. Ava allowed the pause, not to create pressure, but to let the reality settle fully. "This court will be forwarding these findings to the appropriate review board effective immediately," she continued, and with that, the process moved beyond the room, beyond the moment, into something formal, something structured, something that would continue regardless of what was said next. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, just a fraction of a second, but enough to signal recognition, because now the situation was no longer unfolding. It had already taken shape. Ava closed the document once more, her hand resting on it lightly. "Until that review is complete, your conduct within this courtroom will be observed with particular attention," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. And in that moment, the shift became complete, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute, because the authority that had once been assumed was now defined by something else entirely, something measured, something recorded, something that did not rely on presence or perception, but on truth. And as the courtroom prepared to continue, one thing was clear in a way that could not be reversed. This was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of accountability. The courtroom did not return to normal after that. It settled into something sharper, something more aware, as if every person present now understood they were no longer just participating in routine proceedings, but witnessing the quiet unfolding of something far more significant. Judge Ava Carter allowed the weight of her last statement to linger just long enough before moving forward, not rushing, not softening, simply continuing, because control was no longer something that needed to be asserted. It had already been established. The clerk cleared his throat softly and resumed reading the docket. But even his voice carried a new level of precision, each word carefully enunciated, as if accuracy itself had become part of the atmosphere. Attorneys leaned in, more attentive than before, their movements smaller, more deliberate, and along the side of the room Officer Daniel Brooks remained still, but no longer unnoticed, no longer part of the background, because now his presence carried context, and context changes everything. Ava turned another page in her file, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her focus, something that extended beyond the immediate case, something that connected the moment to a larger frame. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice even, measured, "that the conduct addressed earlier has been formally noted." The sentence was procedural, almost routine on the surface, but within it was a finality that could not be undone, because once something enters the record, it becomes part of the structure, part of the system, no longer subject to interpretation or dismissal. Brooks felt that more than anything that had been said before, not because it was louder, but because it was permanent, and permanence leaves no room for denial. He inhaled slowly, controlled, his posture holding, but the certainty that once defined it had shifted into something else, something more aware. Ava continued without raising her voice. "This court will proceed with its duties as scheduled," she said, and with that, the balance between accountability and function was restored, not as a compromise, but as a continuation, because justice does not pause. It integrates, it absorbs, and it moves forward with everything it has acknowledged. The next case was called, voices resumed, arguments presented, objections raised and addressed, but beneath all of it, there was a new layer, something unspoken yet clearly understood. The system had seen something, and it had responded, and that response would not be forgotten. Brooks shifted his gaze briefly toward the bench, not directly meeting her eyes this time, but aware of her presence in a way that was no longer casual, no longer dismissive, because now he understood that what he had once seen as just another individual in the room had been something far more significant all along. Ava listened to the proceedings with the same composed attention, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, but her awareness unmistakable, and every now and then, without drawing attention to it, her eyes would move briefly, not scanning, not searching, but acknowledging, confirming, ensuring that what had been set into motion remained in place. The bailiff stood straighter than before, the attorney spoke with a touch more care, and even the smallest details, the shuffle of paper, the clearing of a throat, seemed to carry intention, because the room had learned something, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and clarity has a way of reshaping behavior without needing to demand it. Brooks remained where he was, but internally something had shifted completely, not just in how he stood, but in how he understood the space around him, because for the first time, he was not the one defining the environment. He was part of it, subject to it, accountable within it, and that realization settled deeply, quietly, without spectacle. Ava closed the current file and placed it aside, preparing for the next matter. Her movements as steady as they had been from the beginning, because for her, nothing had changed. She had always been in this position, always carried this authority. It was simply that now, everyone else could see it, and as the courtroom continued, one truth remained clear, not spoken, not written, but understood by every person present. The moment that had begun with assumption had ended with definition. And once something is defined within a system like this, it does not fade, it remains, shaping everything that follows. By the time the final case of the morning was called, The courtroom no longer felt like the same place it had been less than an hour earlier. Not because the walls had changed or the procedures had shifted, but because understanding had settled into every corner of the room. Quiet, firm, and impossible to ignore. Judge Ava Carter remained composed behind the bench, her presence steady as ever, reviewing the last set of documents with the same calm precision that had defined her from the very beginning. And yet now, that calm carried recognition, not just from the system, but from every individual within it. The attorneys spoke with clarity, their arguments structured, respectful, measured. The clerk moved with efficiency, no hesitation, no uncertainty, and even the smallest sounds, the turning of a page, the soft echo of a voice, felt aligned with something greater than routine. Officer Daniel Brooks stood where he had been assigned, but the weight of that position had changed. Entirely, it was no longer a place of quiet authority. It was a place of awareness, of reflection, and whether he admitted it or not, something inside him had shifted, not through confrontation, not through force, but through realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once but settles slowly, deeply, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Ava closed the final file and placed it neatly on the stack before her, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if time itself moved in accordance with her decisions. She looked up, her gaze moving across the courtroom, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, and in that brief moment, the room felt still again, not tense, not uncertain, just present. "This session is adjourned," she said, her voice even, carrying through the space without effort, and as the sound of the gavel followed, light but definitive, the room responded as one. Chairs shifting, people rising, the structured order dissolving back into motion. But the clarity remained. Brooks did not move immediately, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because for a moment, he stood there absorbing everything that had just unfolded, not the words, not the procedures, but the meaning beneath them, because what had happened in that room was not just a correction, it was a revelation, the kind that does not fade once it is understood. Ava gathered her materials, standing from the bench with the same composed presence, and as she stepped away, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for validation, because authority had already been established in the only way that matters, through truth, through consistency, through the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where one stands. Brooks finally moved, stepping back slightly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by assumption, but by something more grounded, more aware. And as the courtroom emptied, one truth remained, not spoken, not written, but carried in the silence that followed. He had walked into that room believing he understood power, believing it was something you showed, something you enforced, something that belonged to those who wore it visibly. But what he encountered instead was something entirely different, something that did not need to raise its voice, did not need to demand attention, because it was already rooted in something deeper, something unshakable. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the building returning around him, that understanding stayed with him, quiet but clear, because some lessons are not taught through conflict, they are revealed through truth, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. He thought he knew who belonged in that room, but that day, the room itself answered him, and it answered without hesitation.